It was over 10 years ago that I was organizing a men's breakfast for the church I was a part of. And we did these breakfasts on a Saturday morning. It was sort of a once-a-year type event. You try to get all your friends to come and invite people. And we wanted to have a great guest speaker for this men's breakfast, somebody who would sort of be a draw, maybe somebody famous like a football player or this or that. And we tried every avenue we could think of. We invited all these different people. Nothing was working. We were racking our brains. I was in a little group of people trying to figure this out, and nothing seemed to be coming to us. And who's going to speak at this breakfast? We can't think of it. And maybe, a person from a business arena, maybe a person from sports, maybe a person from the media, or this or that. So who's going to speak to these guys? It would be a draw. Finally, one guy, he says, well, I think we should get a scientist. And I kind of laughed. I thought, okay, who's that going to be? And he said, yeah, I think we should get a scientist because it'd be great to have somebody speak on creation evolution. That whole topic. I think that's intriguing and it would draw people out. And as soon as he said that, it dawned on me, that's my dad. Like, my dad is a scientist. He has a PhD in chemical engineering. He's the most brilliant man I've ever met to this day. And he loves creation evolution. He loves talking about how you can believe in creation and be great at science and believe in science, that they can mesh together. I was like, that's him. So I asked him. Sure enough, he said, I'd be delighted. And he came and spoke to our men that day. And we had a good crowd of men out. And my dad began to share. And I was excited for everybody to see how smart he was and how great this was, and to learn things. And sure enough, he shared some wonderful ideas around this idea of creation and evolution and how faith meshes with science and all this. But he didn't take very long on that before he started to tell about his own childhood here in Saskatchewan, of all places, And he grew up around Cornack, that area, and various towns, and he talked about that. And then he talked about being a young adult at the University of Saskatchewan, and as he was there, kind of having this crisis of faith and wrestling with his faith, and then eventually reading a gentleman named C.S. Lewis, and through that, giving his heart to Christ, and then being a part of a church that loved and embraced him and helped him grow in his faith journey, and then meeting a lovely young lady who was also a believer. That was my mom, and yeah, so I'm listening to all of this, and part of me is listening to it going, no, you're supposed to tell us how brilliant you are and give us these intricate details about molecules and whatever, of science. But the longer he went about his own journey, the more I just sat there in total awe. Partly just to be amongst men and hear somebody tell their story about how God wrote on their lives, but partly for me as a son. I'd heard his story in bits and pieces before, all my life long, but to hear it all kind of told at once to a whole group of people and sit there in the audience, I'll tell you, it was so impactful for me. And this is what we're saying in this series, that everyone, no matter who you are, everybody has a story. In fact, everybody is living a story. The pages of the story of your life are being written as we speak, as we're here right now. They're being written each and every day, right from birth. Our story begins to be told. In fact, when my kids were toddlers, my kids are teenagers now, if you can believe it. It's scary. And they're actually all right now at boot camp, at our youth camp. They're finishing that up. We had 20-some people head to that this weekend, and so that's where they are. But when they were toddlers, when I try to remember back that far, and I was putting them to bed, sometimes they'd ask me to tell them a story. And my favorite story to tell them was to always try to hide the details and keep vague the names and so on. But my favorite story to tell them was their own story, right? To tell them about how they were born and how they came into the world and a little bit of their childhood. And somewhere along the line, they'd pick it up and they'd go, Dad, that's me. And of course, they were partly being cynical there, but partly they were just delighting in hearing a little bit about themselves. We love to know that our lives have meaning, that we have a story to tell. But before we get far in life, our story gets marred by sin. I mean, we're born in sin, it says in Psalm 51, and we live in this broken world, and all kinds of pages get written in our lives that are part of that marring and that brokenness, and it doesn't matter who we are, that's part of our reality, and so that gets written into our lives. And then, of course, other people write into the story of our lives, both positively and negatively, our parents, our friends, our teachers, our siblings, and so on, and all of these things, and certainly our circumstances, and then, of course, the older we get, the more our own choices affect the stories of our lives, right? And begin to tell stories in our lives. And so all of these things write these pages into our lives, positively and negatively. Every thought, every choice, every experience, every person we come in contact with, All of this writes it. And it's really important to stop and think, what is the story? What is the story that my life tells? Some stories are sad stories, hard stories, difficult stories. Some are wonderful stories. I was sharing with you last week, you meet people, and some people, their life is so clear. Some difficult stories. Some people, their story is just that people are mean, right? And people will eat you up and spit you out and use and abuse you, and they've been hurt. And that's their story, really, is that just, life, people can't be trusted. Other people's story is more just a kind of a bitter story. Life is just unfair, It hasn't treated me the way I deserve to be treated. It hasn't. It's affected me in ways that I never deserved and I don't like, and it's unfair. One of the saddest kind of stories that I think of that some lives tell is just the bored story. The bored story. It's the story of a life where you just look at a person's life and they have nothing to live for. They get up in the morning, they eat, they live, they have a family, they work, whatever, and then they die. And that's the life. And I just think, oh. Of course, there's positive stories. There's the adventurer story. Those people are fun. We all know people who are adventurers. And the story of their life is, go get 'em, man. Live your life. Take risks. Don't miss anything. Wow, right? And they're always telling us about their latest adventures. Some people, they tell the positive story of turning your lemons into lemonade, right? And they're positive people, and they've learned how to take their trials and stumbling blocks and make them stepping stones. I was thinking this week, some people, the message of their life is sort of the achiever message. It's like you can do it. No matter where you came from or what you've been through, you can do more than you would think. If you discipline yourself and if you work really hard, you can achieve more than you think. It's the achiever message. But the powerful thing, the miraculous thing, the God thing, the cool thing, the thing that we want to talk about in the My Story series is what happens when God's story comes and intersects with our story. When God's story comes and begins to weave its way into the story of our lives. And the miraculous and amazing and wonderful thing is God indeed does. If you let Him, if you invite Him, God will come and tell a new story in your story. He'll take your messy and broken story and He will redeem it. In fact, God is in the life-redeeming business. That's what God does. The word redeem means to reclaim, to repossess, to take back. It means to retrieve or regain or recover. And what God really does when He enters a human life is He takes us from where we've been, what we've been through, and He says, hey, I have a better story to tell. I have an original story, who you were meant to be. God doesn't take you and make you somebody you're not. He takes you and makes you who you truly are. Right? He takes the original image that He meant us to be, and He begins to paint that in or write that into our story. And when God changes a life, when God transforms a life, when God redeems a life, that's the powerful thing. That's the most powerful story there is. In fact, really, the best story in the world is the story of God entering humanity and bringing redemption to humanity through Jesus. Jesus dying on the cross, rising from the dead, offering forgiveness of sins and redeeming lives. But that story only becomes tangible, experienceable, a reality when that story enters a human life. When it's not just about God redeeming the world, but when it's God redeeming Sam and God redeeming Fred and God redeeming Ann and God redeeming John. It's when God comes into a specific life. That's the miracle of miracles. So this is what I want to encourage you in this series. That when God is invited into your life, He will begin to write fresh pages into your story, and then your story will become the best story ever told because it really becomes God's story. Now, it goes beyond that. From there, God wants our story, not just to be our story, and we go, yay, thank you, God. You wrote new pages on my story. You redeemed it. That's great. He wants our story to be a kind of testimony, to be a kind of declaration of who God is and how God works, a kind of invitation to the world around us, to the people around us. That's why Jesus said, He said, hey, you don't light a lamp and then hide it. No, you put it out so that people can see by it. Your story's not meant to be hid. The Apostle Paul, he says you're supposed to shine like stars, or the way it says it here in 1 Peter chapter 2. It says, you are the ones chosen by God, chosen for the high calling of priestly work, chosen to be a holy people, that's set apart, God's instruments to do his work and speak out for him. What's that going to look like? To tell others of the night and day difference he made for you, from nothing to something, from rejected to accepted. 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10. So last week I shared with you why. Why should you tell your story? Why should you be that very thing right there on that screen? Why should you tell the difference he made for you? And I said there's 4 reasons. The first reason is because others will come to trust in the Savior as they hear your story. That's what David said in Psalm 40. Many will see and hear and be amazed, and they will trust in the Lord. So people come to trust in God as you tell your story. Another reason is that it encourages people who already believe. I mean, wasn't that amazingly encouraging this morning to see people just sharing some of their story on those cardboard testimonies? It encourages those who already believe. Another reason is because it glorifies God. That's the third reason. When you tell your story, it's a way of praising God for what he's done for you. And then the last reason is that it keeps it fresh in your own life. Keeps it fresh. Every time you tell your story, it helps you retrace the hand of God and see afresh the hand of God. And it even helps you see how God's hand is working in your present day. So here's what I want to do today. I want to share with you 3 principles about how you can tell your story. Because I think as we hear this, we think, okay, I'd like that, but I don't really know what to say. I mean, I don't really know. It's complicated. I don't know if my story even matters. I don't even know if I have much of a story. You know, like other people, I see theirs and I'm like, oh, that's cool. Oh, that's good. But I don't really have one. I don't really know how to share mine, and I don't really know how it works. And so I'm going to give you 3 pieces of advice, and here's what I want you to do with these 3 pieces of advice. 1 is, practice them, so use them in figuring out your story. But 2 is, as you listen to these, ask yourself, how is God working? Ask yourself, say, I want to discern the story of my life as God is weaving his hand into it. And for some of you, that's looking back over the years. For some of you, that's just right fresh right now. I think for all of us, it's a little bit of both. And so wrestle with that as we talk through this. And the 3 principles I'm going to share with you come right out of gospel stories. So we're going to look at 3 and a half gospel stories and that describe these 3 principles. People who encountered Jesus and then shared their story. So the first principle is this: keep it simple. Okay? Keep it simple. We get so confusing so fast, don't we? When we're describing things or telling things, it's easy to start just getting bogged down in details and trying to understand it all and have it all figured out. And many times, the more we try to explain something, the less clear we are. In fact, there's a whole bunch about our lives and about our stories that we don't even understand ourselves. And sometimes what we're tempted to do is take the parts we don't understand and just make up explanations for them. Right? Because, hey, it sounds better and it sounds clear and it sounds more confident. But the truth is, it just sounds silly. The more we try to make up stuff to fill in the blanks where we don't understand things, it takes the authenticity out of our story. It's good that you don't understand it all. It's good that you don't have it all figured out. So this comes from John chapter 9. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. John chapter 9 is a fascinating story. This is the one we'll take the most time in. It's a story of Jesus. The whole chapter is bound up in this story. Jesus is with his disciples. They're walking along, and there's a blind man there. And he's been blind since birth, blind right from the day he was born. His whole life he's been blind, and everybody knows this. And the disciples ask Jesus a theological question, an important theological question. They say, hey, Jesus, how does this work? Was it this guy's sin that caused him to be born blind? Like somehow God knew he was going to sin and caused him to be born blind, or maybe he sinned right in the womb, or, was it that? Or was it his parents' sin? And, you think, wow, what kind of question is that? But there is a connection between our sin and the consequences of our sin in our world. And so the disciples are trying to figure this out. They're wrestling with this, and they're wrestling with the theology of this. And people assumed that if he was born blind, there must be something wrong with him. He must have done something wrong to deserve this. So the disciples are asking about this. And of course, Jesus answers like he often does with our deep questions and theological. He hardly really answers it. He kind of turns the topic. He says, you know what? Truth is, it's not this guy's sins or his parents' sins. Come on. He says, really, this guy's here right now because God wants to work in his life. God is going to be glorified in this guy's life. And then Jesus does this crazy miracle. Now, Jesus has done lots of miracles, but this one, I've never seen this one anywhere else. This is just such a wild miracle. He bends down and he gets some dirt and then he spits in the dirt. He spits, like, I don't know if he, does that or what, but he spits in the dirt. And he makes mud out of his spit and dirt, and then he wipes it on the guy's eyes. It's so, you think, what is going on? It's so funny, I was reading about this week and trying to learn about this, and people have the wildest theories as to why that is, what the spit means and what the mud means and the dirt means and all this stuff. And I was just like, wow, that was pretty awesome theories. But I'll just tell you, it's strange, okay? The more I studied it, the more I just thought, this is one of the weirdest miracles ever, Wow. And I tried to, think maybe for Jews, spitting was normal, or maybe this or that. But no matter how you tell this story, it's just plain strange, okay? In fact, I even thought, I'm going to watch, some of those gospel YouTube videos where they've reenacted the gospel, some of the movies, because maybe they've kind of explained it. It was weird in the movies too. I'm just telling you right now, it was weird. So he does this, and then he says to the guy, "Go wash in this pool." Well, of course, the guy wants to go wash, right? He's got somebody spitting mud on his eyes, So he does this. He goes and washes. Oh, let me just mention, because we're like, wow, that's so weird. Why did Jesus do that? And I don't know is my answer. Okay, just keep it simple. But maybe part of the deal is Jesus never heals people the same way over and over again. And I think part of the reason is we're tempted when we look at some of these things to try to copy or turn the way God works into a formula, right? We'll just say, yeah, these 4 steps, you do these 4 things, and this is how it works, and da-da-da-da, and every time you have God in a box, God will break out of that box. So maybe that's partly why Jesus does it this way this time, just to mess with everybody's boxes, It's like... Nobody's going to turn that one into a formula, I'll tell you that, right? So, or if you do, nobody go to your church, right? Because that'd just be hard church to attend, right? If you want to come up for prayer at the end. Anyway, where are we in the story? He washes his eyes, and lo and behold, as he's washing his eyes, what happens? He can see for the first time in his entire life. He can see. He starts to look around. He sees water. And he sees people. He looks into their faces, into their eyes. He sees color. He sees the sky. He sees buildings. He sees plants. He sees food. And you can just imagine, this guy's healed. And he's walking around and enjoying this and experiencing this. Well, some people notice him doing, just going around like, I can see, this is so cool. People who can see after spending their whole life blind, they'd be noticeable, right? They're walking around like this, And they'd see him, and somebody says, hey, isn't that the guy who used to sit over there? I don't even know his name because nobody even cared to learn his name. But isn't that guy? And his friends say, well, sure looks like him. And then some people, well, it is him. And then other people are like, it can't be him. Maybe he had a twin. Maybe there's somebody who just looks like him. So they're arguing about this, and finally they go to him themselves and just ask. Good idea. So they ask him, verse 10, who healed you? What happened? And he told them, the man they called Jesus made mud, spread it over my eyes, and told me, go to the pool of Siloam. And I really appreciate that he doesn't say he used his spit to make mud. He just says he made mud. It's nice that he didn't go into great detail. To wash yourself. And I went and washed, and now I can see. Simple explanation. Where is he now, they asked. I don't know, he replied. It's so good to just be able to say, I don't know. He didn't have to have it all figured out. He just said, I don't know. Then they took the man who'd been born blind to the Pharisees because it was on the Sabbath that Jesus had made mud and healed him. And apparently that's a no-no, okay? You're not supposed to heal people on the Sabbath. So apparently they're in trouble. They're getting taken to the principal's office. So the Pharisees asked the man all about it. He told them, he put mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, I could see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he is working on the Sabbath. Others said, how can you, an ordinary sinner, do such miraculous signs? So there was deep division of opinion among them. Which, by the way, when Jesus shows up, when God confronts us with his truth, it does divide us. You know, you land on one side or the other. Either he is the Messiah and he really changes lives, or he's not. But you got to pick, right? We get put there. So there's a great division of opinion among them. The Pharisees again questioned the man who'd been blind and demanded, "What's your opinion about this man who healed you?" And I love his reply. "I think he must be a prophet." It's like, I think he must be like something because, you know, it's what happened to me. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see. So they called in his parents. And they asked him, "Is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he see?" His parents replied, "We know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself." And then this verse is kind of sad. It says his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who'd announced that anyone saying Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, "He is old enough, ask him." So they were too afraid to say the name of Jesus. They were okay with kind of describing it in vague detail, in vague terms, but they didn't want to use his name because they knew that would sort of slot them in a certain slot. It would get them in some trouble. And I would encourage you, when you think about your story, try to go past the vagueness of thinking, well, I got religion, or well, I went to church, and try, if you can, to name his name, Jesus. It's Jesus who came into my life. It's Jesus who touched my life. It's Jesus who set me free. There's something about naming the name. You know, around our church, you know how we say it? Simply Jesus, right? Simply Jesus. In Acts chapter 4, verse 11, it says, "There is no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved." That's it. It's his name. And it's not easy to say his name sometimes in certain contexts or places, but I'll tell you, it's good to get to the name. It's good to get to Jesus when we're telling our story. These parents were too afraid to do that. Verse 24, "So for the second time they called in the man who'd been born blind and told him, 'God should get the glory for this. But we know this man Jesus is a sinner.' And then here's verse 25, and this is what I really want you to get out of this story. Here's what he answered, the seeing man. 'I don't know whether he is a sinner.'" Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. "But one thing I do know, though I was blind, now I see." Though I was blind, now I see. I don't have it all figured out. I don't know about your theological questions. I don't know about this whole Sabbath debate you guys are fighting over. I don't know if he's a sinner or this or that. All I know is I was blind, now I see. And there's something wonderful and beautiful about just admitting what we don't know. You know, sometimes people come to us with a million questions, or even sometimes when we're trying to describe our own story, we sort of get into all this detail. And we try to sort of explain everything. And I'll tell you, we're far better to leave the simplicity in our story and say, "I don't understand all of this part or all of that, but what I do know is this." And then name the simple things you do know. There's something authentic about that, something real about that, something beautiful about that. And one of the beautiful things is you don't have to understand it all. In fact, as the story goes on, it's quite interesting. What happens is they have a little argument with him here, and he's a little bit snarky with the Pharisees. He's like, because they keep pressing him. Finally, he's like, "Do you want to be his disciples too, or what? Like, why do you keep asking me? I already told you, And they get going back and forth. Finally, they throw him out of the synagogue. They kick him out. "You can't worship here anymore. You're an outcast now." It's a pretty big punishment. Jesus hears about it, and he meets up with the guy. Let me just read you what happens at the end of the chapter here. Verse 35, "When Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and said, 'Do you believe in the Son of Man?' The man answered, 'Who is he, sir? I want to believe in him.' 'You have seen him,' Jesus said, 'and he is speaking to you.' 'Yes, Lord, I believe,' the man said, and he worshiped Jesus." So here's the thing. You don't have to understand it all to just testify about what God has done for you. This guy continued to grow in his understanding. And it doesn't mean to say, "Well, I'm just going to stay simple. I'm just going to do the simple thing." It doesn't mean you don't continue to grow in your understanding. Of course we do. Of course we keep seeking things out. We keep increasing our understanding. We keep looking back on our story and saying, "Wow, I think now that I know a little more of God's word, I can see now that this is how God was working here. This is how God was working there." But you don't have to explain it all at first or know every piece of it. He continued to gain his understanding. In verse 39, then Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. What Jesus is saying is he's saying, you know what? There is a kind of seeing that is far more powerful, far more amazing, far more incredible than a man being born blind and seeing, than physical sight. There's a spiritual seeing. There's encountering Jesus for yourself. There's seeing him, the Messiah, your own Savior. That's a kind of seeing that is way bigger. And there's a kind of blindness that is far worse than the blindness of physical blindness. There's a kind of blindness that comes from pride. There's a kind of blindness that comes from a kind of willfulness that is far worse. And Jesus says that's the kind that matters the most. So this is what I just want to encourage you with this point. As you look at your own story, and as you share your own story, keep it simple. Keep clear that there are lots that you don't understand, and that's okay. And maybe ask this question as you wrestle with your own story and look at how God's influenced your story. What is the simple message of Jesus in my life or in my story? What's the simple message of Jesus in my story? And you can even look at your life and look for themes. For me, it's the theme that I was empty and aching within, and my life was meaningless. And then Jesus filled me and gave me meaning. That's the simple story of Jesus in my life, that he filled me and gave me meaning. Sometimes, as I reflect on my life, or in certain audiences, and this is what will happen as you think through your story, I can see different themes that emerge. One of the themes that emerges when I tell my story, and in certain settings, especially in kind of church settings, because I grew up in church, is that I knew about Jesus, I even believed in Jesus, and had the set of practices of Christianity down. I just didn't really know him for myself. And the simple message of Jesus in my life, in those terms, is Jesus is real. He's really real. Other times, the simple message of Jesus in my life is the message of having generational influence. My parents were both first-generation Christians. They came to know the Lord, and then they shared the Lord with us, and just the wonderful power of sharing that through the generations. So you look at your life and look for those themes. What's the simple message of Jesus in my life? Okay, principle number 2, keep it simple is one. Number 2 is keep it invitational. Keep it invitational. This comes from John chapter 1. In John chapter 1, Jesus is calling his disciples, and he comes to a man named Philip, and he invites him to follow him, and Philip excitedly leaves everything, and he follows Jesus. But then he thinks, man, my brother needs to know the Messiah too. And so he goes running back to his brother, Nathanael, and here's what he says. Philip went to look for Nathanael, and he found him. Here we go. We have found the very person Moses and the prophets wrote about. His name is Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth. And look at Nathanael's response. Nazareth? Exclaimed Nathanael. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Now, here's what Philip could have done. He could have said, well, of course, don't you know the Old Testament prophecy in, Micah chapter 4, verse, 853? Don't you know that one? Quit being such a skeptic. Nathanael, just believe, or come on, man, all this. Look what he says. He doesn't argue with them. He doesn't try to convince them in 100 different ways. He doesn't get into complex details. He just says, come and see for yourself. Part of the nature of how God works in human lives, and I think how the church is meant to work in our witness, is that God doesn't pressure, force, coerce. God comes and invites. He's an invitational God. You ever notice this with people? I'm a parent right now of teenagers. As my kids get older, the older they get, the less forcing really works on them. Especially now that my oldest is stronger than me, right? That's even. But I'll tell you, the less sort of saying, you just do, you just listen to me, you just do what I said, you just believe, you just do that, whatever, right? The invitation is far more effective. Right? And it's just true with all of us. When people try to pressure us, force us, manipulate us into things, we resist. And sometimes we're so convinced we need other people to know about Jesus, or we need other people to know about our story, that as we share it, it comes across manipulative or forceful or pushy. I think the better way, the gospel way, is an invitational way of sharing our faith. This is what's happened to me. Come and see for yourself. Oh, you're skeptical? That's okay. Come and see. Oh, you're a different faith? That's okay. Come and see. Oh, you've been through some really hard things and you don't believe in a God? That's okay. Just come and see. You see, really, sharing our faith is less about convincing people of a set of beliefs and more about introducing people to a person. It's invitational. I've told this story before, but it had such an impact on my journey in sharing my faith. I had a friend named Spock that for years and years, it's not his real name, but that's what I called him, okay, Spock. And so we played badminton together, and for years and years, I was attempting to share my faith with him. Every time we'd get together. In fact, I prayed for him almost every single day of my life for years. And we would get together weekly, and we'd play badminton. Then afterwards, we'd visit, sometimes on the sidelines, sometimes we'd go for a swim or in the sauna at the place we played badminton there. And we'd do this week after week, and often he would bring up God, or I'd bring up God, and we'd talk about faith stuff. And in fact, as it got kind of normal for him to bring me his weird God questions. Do you know what weird God questions are? It's like people who find the most obscure verse in the Bible and then ask you about it. And so he'd do that. Often in the sauna, he'd say, it says in, such and such a book, chapter, I'd never even heard of the book of the Bible before, but sure enough, there it was, and he'd ask me some obscure question. My answer was always the same, I don't know, but God loves you, and he wants a relationship with you, right? And we'd have that little visitor. Sometimes there'd be a little explanation, but he always steered in that direction. Well, one time we're sitting in the sauna, and he asks me a weird God question, and there's a group of people in there, right? It's a public place, and this one guy hears this conversation, and he is a Bible-thumping, angry preaching, shouting, pressurized, manipulating guy, okay? It's the best way I can say it. The kind of guy you all feel really uncomfortable around and you're like, oh, help, get me out of here. So this is this guy. And he hears us mention God, and he's just like, God? Let's talk about God? And, he starts preaching away to all of us in this sauna. We don't know him. We don't know his name. We never met this guy before. And everybody in the sauna, as hot as it is, freezes up, right? We're all like, what do we do, And so we're all sitting there, and he's, and telling us we're sinners and we're going to hell, and we better believe, and whatever, all this crazy stuff. And he's getting into all this stuff and just talking. He won't even stop talking, And pretty quick, somebody leaves, and then another person leaves, and then another person leaves. Well, Spock and I, we just outweighted the guy. Because the deal with the sauna, if you sit in there long enough, everybody has to go eventually, right? Because it's hot. And he just finally couldn't stand the heat anymore. He left. Spock and I were left there alone. And Spock looks at me and he goes, oh man, I am so thankful you're not trying to convert me. And I looked at him, I said, Spock, of course I'm trying to convert you. Like, you know that. I've been sharing my faith with you for years, of course. And he looked at me and he said this. He said, yeah, but not like that. Not like that. And I said, yeah, definitely not like that, But it really struck me. There's an invitational method that I think is far more effective and far more like God himself, the way he relates to us. In fact, in John chapter 4, it's another story. Jesus is at a meeting with this woman at the well. She's a Samaritan woman. It's strange that he's talking to her. He gets visiting with her, and he tells her to ask for living water. And he finally convinces her to ask for this living water, and they have this little discussion, and he just keeps leading her in the right direction. And finally he says, and I'm the Messiah. And she's like, oh man, I just met the Messiah. And he had actually prophesied, he kind of read her mail about her life. He knew things that were going on in her life that let her know that, wow, this really is him. She goes running back to town to tell people, and look at the way she says it here. She says, come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ? And then they went out of the town. They were coming to him. And this is fascinating. This woman, it records that she was a woman who had 5 husbands, and the man she was living with now wasn't her husband, right? You imagine if she went back to town, and in that day, women weren't very well respected, and then her own lifestyle probably lowered her respect even more. You imagine if she went back to town and said, hey, everybody, I figured it out. I've thought it through and done my studies, and I know now who the Messiah is. Okay, who is it? It's the dude out at the well, right? Okay, what should we do? Well, you need to believe in him and change. You imagine they'd look at her like, you're crazy, right? You know how you've lived, and you're telling us all this stuff, right? There's no integrity in that. But look at the way she says it. Come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Imagine people's eyebrows just going, whoa. We were just gossiping about everything you ever did over here in the corner. And there's a guy who told you. And she doesn't say, and you should believe in him. She says, come see. Could it be? It's invitational. And then look what happens. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them. And he stayed there 2 days, and many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world. She just invited them. This is what happened to me. I don't have it all figured out. I'm certainly not perfect. But come and see. Could it be? It's not trying to force my set of beliefs on somebody. It's an invitation to meet a person who changed my life. So here's the question I want to leave with you at this point. What is the invitation of my story? What's the invitation of my story? When I tell my story, what invitation comes out of it? Is it come and see what real freedom looks like? Come and see what love is, what true love is. Come and discover what it is. Come and see what it is to live for the Master Jesus instead of just living for yourself. For me, my story is, do you feel the meaninglessness of life? The meaninglessness of all these pursuits? Then come and see this person who filled my heart and gave me meaning like nothing in this world could. It's just an invitation. You think about your own journey. Come and see what it's like to have your shame wiped away when you know you've messed up. Come and see. So ask that question. What's the invitation of my story? So the first point, keep it simple. Second point, keep it invitational. Last point is just keep telling it. Keep telling it. In Mark chapter 5, Jesus and his disciples, they cross a lake, a pond, and they get across there to an area that's kind of an outcast area. And they're there, and there's a guy there who's full of demons. And he's a crazy man. In fact, he's chained up because he's so dangerous to people and dangerous to himself. And this guy starts manifesting, these demons start manifesting. And Jesus goes over to him, has this conversation with him, and casts the demons out of him and sets the guy free. And then it's really interesting what happens at the end of this story. It says, as Jesus was getting into the boat, so now they've finished their ministry, they're leaving. The man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Sounds like a good thing, right? Come with, we'll keep growing, you'll keep learning. But Jesus said, no. Go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been. So the man headed off to visit the Decapolis, or the 10 towns of that region, and began to proclaim the great things that Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed at what he told them. I think this is so important because there's a temptation in all of us to have Jesus right into our story and then to just kind of go, oh, that's so comfortable, that's so nice. I just want to sit with my story. I just want to be around other people who have the same story. Churches get this way, right? Just sort of us four and no more. It's one of the things that breaks my heart as a pastor. I meet Christians, I meet leaders, I even meet pastors who think the church exists for the church. It breaks my heart. I think, if the church existed for the church, we'd all be in heaven already, right? Because we get to be the church for millions of years in heaven. If that's what we existed for, we could do that. If we're here just to preach sermons and sing songs, we can do that for eternity. The church has a mission to accomplish. That's why we're here, to make disciples, to go into all the world, to go to the very ends of the earth, to find anybody and everybody who's living in darkness and invite them into the light. And yet it's tempting. It's tempting for all of us, to want to just hide our story, stay comfortable. That's why Jesus said, no, you don't hide your light. Let it shine. Tell your story. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to get every single detail, all perfect. In fact, this is one of the things I encourage people. I say, tell your story in 100 different ways. Try different ways. The more you tell it, the more familiar with it you become, the more you'll start to trace the hand of God in various ways around your story. In fact, I encourage people this. Have a 1 minute, a 5 minute, and then a full version of your story. Right? so that you can share it. And you don't have to say everything every time. It's just get around, get telling your story. And the more we do that, the more we're able to let that light shine in various ways. I can't tell you how many times, dozens of times, I've sat with people, I've been in meetings, I've been in various places, and I thought of sharing a little bit of my story, and then I pulled back and didn't share it. And I went away from those times going, I wish I would have just done it anyway. But I had some excuse. On the flip side, I have dozens of times where I've been in a setting and thought, should I, shouldn't I? Should I bring this up? Should I just go there? And then I did. And after those times, I go away from those times and go, I'm so thankful. I didn't just cop out. I didn't just come up with an excuse. I'm so thankful I went there. So let me encourage you in that. Just go there. Go ahead and tell the story. Tell it to your friends. Tell it to your family. Tell it to each other. Tell it in every way you possibly can. So keep it simple. Make it invitational. And then just get it told. Get it told. And as you do that, as we all do that, we'll discern and discover in increasing ways God's grace, God's work in our lives. And of course, it's not something that happens once, so many years ago in our lives. God is continuously writing fresh things into our lives. And part of telling your story is inviting God in fresh ways. I remember, I think it was 2 years ago, my family and I had the opportunity to head to Florida for a vacation. And part of our vacation, we were doing other things, but we took time to head to the place where I bent my knee to Jesus and asked him to be real to me, where I just said, I'm all in. And it was in a jungle on a place called Merritt Island, Florida. And here I came back to this place over 20 years after that had happened. It's the first time I'd ever been back, this little camp. And I'll never forget just going back into that place and looking at those trees. I don't remember which tree it was, they're all jungle trees in there. And I just picked a tree and shared a little bit with my family, the story, and brought my kids to that place, And then my family said, do you want some time alone? I said, I'd love that. Love some time just to pray. And my family wandered off, and there I am in the jungle wondering if a snake was going to come and get me or something, And I reflected back to that day that I bent my knee and just said, God, if you're real, I got to know you. I want you in my life. And I thought, what do you pray? What do you pray 20-some years later when you're in the very same spot remembering what God did? And of course, I started with thank you. But then you know what I did? I fell on my knees again. And you know what prayer I prayed? I prayed the exact same prayer. I just said, God, if you're real, and I've discovered you as real over all these years, then I still want to know you. And I still want to be close to you, and I'm still all in. I want you to write that story again today and tomorrow and the next day in fresh ways, in whatever circumstances I'm in, wherever I'm going. Keep writing your story in my life, God. And it looks different on different days, right? We go through good things, hard things, painful things, struggles, and circumstantial, emotional, relational, all these things. And we just keep inviting Jesus. Keep writing your story in my life, Lord.